It's great to be here. Claire and I met at Sydney University. We graduated in 2007, so this is our home battlefield, playing ground. We are here tonight in our capacity as Archrival. As Dagmar said, we started Archrival in 2011, so we still consider ourselves emerging or embryonic in the industry. And we want to talk about change as a competitive advantage. We've spoken before in talks about agency, but in this talk we were really interested in being specific about the idea of change. And when we talk about change, we mean change in practice, not only in what is created, but more importantly, how it's created. And stemming from what Dagmar mentioned, the idea that our industry is in crisis. There's been a lot of reporting internationally and a lot of discussion about the idea of the decline of architecture and the different strains that the profession is under, and that we need to evolve and adapt. So that's our focus tonight through the lens of our practice, which is Archrival. So to give you a really sort of brief rundown, this is what Archrival is. It's run predominantly by Claire and myself, but we do have a broader network of collaborators that we draw on, which are both industry contacts and people who we've reached out to or who have reached out to us. So we call it an extracurricular practice because it's literally a second job for both of us. It's not our main income stream, and we don't spend sort of 9 to 5 on it, although it does often take up a very large amount of our time. And it's a non-profit organisation. We set it up that way because we explicitly wanted to operate outside of the traditional commercial model, and we were interested in having a sort of advocacy role in the profession so we could attract different people to be part of the projects. And without that focus, we're open to grants and volunteer work and different sorts of input, which is possible with a non-profit sort of realm. We're committed to innovation and thinking in practice, and we like to do this through collaboration. We used to speak a lot about collaboration and authorship. I won't speak about that now, but basically we try really hard to collaborate quite freely and quite early on with other people aside from architects in our projects, because we think they have different people from different creative industries have really progressive, different ways of thinking about design, which is useful for us. And we're most interested in strategy and this basic mantra that standard practices in the industry should be challenged in order to remain valid. So our everyday work, which we won't talk about, looks a bit like this. Claire was previously associate at Sam Crawford Architects, and I've been running my own practice since 2009. And so, between us working on residential and commercial and really standard sort of traditional architecture projects around Sydney. And Claire is now head of program at Object Australian Design Centre. So we do have day-to-day roles that pay the rent. Archrival is our extracurricular practice, and these projects have enabled us to do sort of research and experimentation outside of the traditional model. And they're projects that basically started as unsolicited, self-created and self-funded. So experiments or almost artworks as seen by some people, and different types of projects where they were often installations or temporary things, participating in exhibitions or producing concepts for things, and a lot of event-based stuff. We've done things at the Biennale, Fashion Week, Art and About, Sydney Art Month, things like that. So much more public, transient projects. And with all of this work, even though it sometimes looks like artwork, we really operate with a strong agenda. We always try and follow a sort of methodology and agenda for practice and what we can explore or achieve through each project or through each action. So apart from challenging the status quo, we're really interested in the idea of creating better clients and doing public work that can have impact on the public realm, whether it's changing someone's idea or revealing something about the process or something behind a project that can help people have a better connection with architecture and what we do and how we do it. Because it's not our main income stream, we can experiment and innovate freely. So we're not bound by the sort of drive to fulfill a client's brief or to fill certain commercial demands. And we try and collaborate with as many different design professionals as we can, such as engineers or landscape architects or graphic designers, or there's a huge list of collaborators. And all of the projects are small. We're not trying to claim we've done anything big. They've been very small strategic actions, carefully crafted, and we really think that even a small project can have a big effect. It can have a follow-on effect, so you don't need to think too big. And our main focus, going back to that idea of the industry in crisis, at the bottom is just a snapshot from an old report now. It's the RIBA Building Futures report that was published in 2011. And this report looked at architecture in Britain and the idea that medium practice was basically in decline, and that in 2025 that role of the architect might no longer exist. And it was quite a serious sort of snapshot of the industry and where it was going. And then on the right, another quote, an idea that the world is going through a period of dramatic change. It's very accelerated change. We need to solve bigger problems faster, population increase, sort of climate change, and that the industry is very slow to respond. Our institutions and our organisations are slow to catch up, and that the sort of idea of architecture and the practice, we're still operating on a much older model, the idea of the romantic idea of doing competitions, or the way that you work and the work ethic is not really sustainable in the current climate. So to deal with all of this heavy stuff, and sorry to rush through, but you could do a whole lecture on that, we started off with one project, and the timing coincided with an EOI to participate in the Venice Biennale in 2012. And the creative directors for the Biennale, for the Australian Pavilion, asked for a really interesting thing. They were asking about agency in the profession, and they asked for submissions where you would present a diagram of your practice and explain how your practice was doing things differently and how you could have increased agency as a result of your processes or your networks or the way that you did things. So we spent a lot of time, the brief sort of fit us perfectly because we just invented Archrival and we're sort of thinking really big. We spent a lot of time developing this diagram, which hasn't come out very well, but basically we tried to draw practice. It was a really difficult exercise, and we envisaged this sort of field of clients and a field of external pressures that were pressing on the industry. That's the left-hand slide. And we envisaged a practice where you could start to form networks, where projects could catalyse other networks or other things, and you could start to strengthen the industry and create a combined field. The last one, you sort of create this more unified, progressive industry that was more connected to all of the different things that were affecting industry, more connected to clients, and also more connected to each other. So architects operating possibly in a more collaborative way instead of a competitive way. Which leads us on to our big ideas. We're going to talk about our 3 key tactics for how to change practice. But to give you some background, these are the sort of big ideas in the background of our practice and the way that we run Archrival. So probably the biggest thing that you can see from our name, the name Archrival, was a tongue-in-cheek sort of play on the way that architects are so competitive and the industry is competitive. But we thought that edge was quite interesting. And since naming the practice, we found a lot of amazing writing from business specialists and analysts about the idea of productive rivalry. So we would argue that some of the ways that practice operates at the moment, things like the competition model, fee bidding and all that sort of thing, is really unproductive rivalry. It doesn't do anything positive for the industry, and there's no sort of positive benefit. And then we started to look at sports models, which some businesses are employing now, the idea of productive rivalry and the way that you can have people working together in a way that their competitiveness can raise the bar, or the collision between their ideas can create a better idea. Or as one of our collaborators, who is actually an ex-professional footballer, says, the magic happens on the field. It's the process and the act of making a project where things happen, and in that way rivalry and competition between designers could become productive and spectacular, like a sporting event. The other thing we've been interested in recently is this idea of moonshot thinking. It's something that Google, I think, coined because they were literally talking about projects on the moon. And they run a whole department where they look at moonshots and projects that seem fantastical or impossible, but are actually, they're actually possible, they're radical, and they look at new solutions for new problems. So the key to moonshot thinking is that you have to redesign the question. You have to invent a new question, and by doing that, you radically reframe your approach and you can move forward rather than incremental change. So that's this idea that it's easier to make something 10 times better than to make it 10% better. So you have to change the question. And then is the idea of ultradisciplinary practice. We wrote something for AR a few years ago, and we were interested in trying to come up with a name for what we were doing, that we were advocating that architects, because we did make buildings, we do make normal, traditional architecture day to day, but we wanted to argue that the other things we were doing, like drawing, making, writing, doing crazy installations, draping things with film, teaching, that it was all a form of research or discourse, and that it was all super relevant to the profession, and also that it was part of what could have been described as the traditional architect spectrum. The architect used to be a builder and a craftsman, also a thinker, also an engineer, and we were interested in really dissolving the boundaries of practice in talking about agency, and we talked a lot about that with our involvement in the Biennale exhibition. But people kept on talking about professional boundaries and being quite strict about what was inside of or outside of the professional boundary. And we thought that this professional boundary was quite unhelpful. And we'll talk about some different examples of practices that are looking outside of that boundary and literally expanding the role of architecture and what we can do, which is a way to survive and a really sort of positive change. One example of this outside of the boundary practice is from one of our collaborators, Vision Arc. They're based in New York, and they are a design consultancy. They describe themselves as a visual research spatial consultancy, and in one of their projects for the World Economic Forum, they were commissioned to look at ways, sort of looking to the future for 2050, and they came up with this idea of design blind spots. So they described a blind spot as fields not currently integrating design thinking. So literally fields where architecture or design could be applied but wasn't yet. And they saw this as an opportunity. They saw it as an opportunity for designers to catalyse their own transition into new modes of practice. So literally broadening our fields of engagement by identifying different areas. And they were talking big scale. They're talking government, planning, resources and industry. From very fine-grained to very large-scale projects where architects could make a difference. And next, Claire will talk about our tactics for change.
Thank you. Since we started in 2011, we are continually self-evaluating. And as we've gone through this process, as Lucy said, we talked a lot about productive rivalry, but we started to consider other tactics as well. So on top of that, we have alternative procurement, which happened right in the beginning and was a methodology for us to create work. And then just recently, we've started thinking about alternative ways for generating revenue. So we're going to spend a bit of time going into each of those tactics and give you some examples around each one. So alternative procurement started off with us considering unsolicited projects. So our very first project was we weren't asked to do the project. We invented it ourselves and approached the Sydney Fringe Festival with an idea. And we were the premise of the project was that we were frustrated with work we were doing, so we invented something ourselves and secured a venue and used the Sydney Fringe as a broadcast methodology to talk about our work. It's something that is really topical at the moment in terms of digital platforms worldwide in terms of Kickstarter. So you can see that community-based projects are using these digital platforms to make projects that are essentially unsolicited. They're responding to needs, but they don't have a specific client. So Kickstarter is really brilliant at creating community events, but it's been widely criticised for use as an architectural build funds resourcer. There is one good example, but essentially as a whole, the way you procure a community-led project is very different to the way you procure a civic build. There's very different stakeholders at play. So in 2012, Sitra in Finland launched Brickstarter, which was essentially a prototype. It wasn't a real digital platform, but it was a prototype for a digital platform that allowed architectural builds to be created. And essentially what they were trying to do was encourage the international digital community to invent a new way of procuring projects. So, this was something that was really interesting for us because we had been doing the same thing at a very, very tiny scale. And now, 3 years after Brickstarter was put out for comment, Neighbourly is going to launch in mid of this year. Neighbourly exists at the moment, but it's just had a massive input from foundation support in terms of financial support to figure out how to make connections between the corporate environment and funding civic projects. So how can the corporate social responsibility of a company respond to community needs? So a local council could put a project up on Neighbourly and have it partially funded by the corporate environment. So from thinking about unsolicited projects at the very tiny scale of Archrival, it's really interesting and dynamic to see these international examples starting to build. And the project that you're probably all aware of is Plus Pool in New York that has been funded by Kickstarter and is probably the best example of a crowd-funded project. If you don't know about it, it raised over $300,000 on Kickstarter to develop the pool and prototypes for the pool. And you can now purchase tiles to continue the support beyond the support that was secured on Kickstarter. And for us, it's really interesting to understand where this project goes from here. They continue to figure out how to build this pool. It's not set in stone that it will be built, but they are making prototypes around all the technology around figuring out how to clean the water from the Hudson River. But what's really interesting to us is if they do figure out how to allow this project to be built in terms of council bureaucracy, who owns this pool in the end? And do the designers own it because they've designed it and they own the company that's called Plus Pool, or do the people who contributed to the support, financially of the pool? And this is all unknown. So we're really aware that this idea of the unsolicited project is changing really quickly around us, and essentially it was a part of how we established Archrival. The other portion, the other side of the coin really, that the way that we consider alternate procurement, apart from unsolicited projects, is our approach to funding. So we put these graphs together to really understand how we approach funding. So on the left-hand side, there is a really simple analysis of some projects that we've worked on. So they're simple residential projects in Sydney, and you can see, so for example, at Bondi Junction, if we use an example that, say, the existing budget started at $920,000, it increases through the length of the project to perhaps $100,000. And, so a project in a standard practice would increase anywhere from 5 to 25% of its original funding base. But the projects that we make they start with very small amounts of funding, and they're usually coming from either Archrival itself or grant funding or independent corporate funding, and then we're able to top up the budget by a much larger proportion, and that's secured through partnerships, mainly through the business and building sector, where we find a lot of support. And it's a way for us to really get momentum around a project, because as the project goes along, we just get more and more partners involved and more people caring about the project, which leads to much better outcomes in terms of the way people engage with the project in the long term after it's been launched. So I'm just going to run through some quick examples of how that plays out in the real world for Archrival. So 11th Hour is that first project that we talked about that was unsolicited with the Sydney Fringe. It was launched at the Carriage Works, and it lasted for how many days? 10 days. And it was in Bay 19 at the Carriage Works in one of the dedicated galleries, and it evolved over time. So we invited the public into the space to take hold of the terrain. There was a series of 50 steel archways, and the community were invited to weave their own elements of space through these archways. So we set up a framework that the community took a hold of and allowed them to define what the space was. It was an interesting process for us because it was the first time that we'd had to let go of control of a project. But in that way, it was really unsolicited in its result as well as its form. And then the other project that we did just before Venice, the Venice Biennale, was Concrete Colony, which was at the Sydney Festival about 6 months later. And the really interesting way that we were able to get this project off the ground, because again it was unsolicited, was that we set up a framework where we had teams of designers and architects build furniture for a festival bar in Hyde Park Barracks. And what they did was they purchased this material. So it's concrete cloth, which is essentially a canvas with sand cement embedded into it, and when you wet it, it goes hard. So we repurposed all these pieces of furniture. So each design team bought in a piece of furniture, paid for the cloth, and we made these through an intense period of 4 days, these pieces of furniture, which were then curated on site at the Sydney Festival to create this installation. So then each Archrival as an entity owned the work, but also each design team owned the work as well. So everyone was able to contribute that way, and was, a really different way for us to us figuring out how to get a project off the ground.
So those were our first two projects, and I think what Claire was just talking about touches on the idea of authorship. We used to talk about this a lot, and the idea that, for example, in the Concrete Colony, because the material we're using is so difficult, it's extremely heavy and dirty, we would have sort of up to 7 people running around each piece at a time, so you couldn't really define who had made what. It was a very organic process, and it was very much a team effort, and we were happy to sort of roll under the banner of Archrival and not try and sort of individually claim any one piece. So this idea of productive rivalry, again, making fun of some of the architects in that picture. The idea that in our industry, and we can't say this enough, we really need to evolve and change. The industry models are outdated and they're not working, and we don't need to go into why, but there's a lot of different pressures. Competition is coming, change is coming from everywhere. We have to change. So this idea of authorship, we were really interested in Archrival providing an open platform where people could experiment in different processes or carry out different skills or explore different things that they weren't able to do in their everyday practice because they were confined by all of the different sort of regulations and processes that naturally exist at work. And this idea that architecture needs an attitude adjustment. The architects crew, who all know each other and fraternise together, it's very much about brand image and the individual. And for us, we weren't interested in individual glory with these projects at all. We were really interested in being proactive and doing things and seeing what happened and getting people involved. So we weren't interested in putting our name to anything specifically, which we thought was a quite different approach to the idea of brand image and the individual hero author, which is what this quote talks about from Jeremy Till, that every act of design is a negotiation and a collaboration. We know in practice, we've practiced each for 10 years or so, and we know that every project is created by a huge amount of people. It's never just the architect who has everything to do with everything, but that architectural culture really encourages the idea of the hero and the author and the genius, and that position was maybe not helpful anymore, and that if you felt lost as a designer, that you should now sort of focus on legitimizing yourself and your practice by describing the process. So through Archrival, we're really interested in the process rather than the product. And that's not to say that we weren't interested in the product, because we are registered architects and we're trained designers, so we're very, very concerned about the product. But the process was what was the exciting bit. It's the experimental part and the part that allowed us to shift and change. And with sort of quite a lot of art training in our background in school and university, we were both really drawn to this idea of the salon, and the idea that maybe in the past, and this is definitely romanticised back to the 1920s, sort of idea of the cafes and all of the artists arguing and debating and copying from one another, but further back to the Renaissance and even before. And interestingly, big business consultancies like McKinsey have actually written about this in detail, the idea of looking to the Renaissance and concepts of collision, so that having an intense room or city full of artists and different people like engineers and builders and architects and painters in a small area, literally running into each other, colliding with one another, would create ideas, would create momentum and change, would raise the bar. So that's what we're really interested in creating, in copying that sort of platform. So once we got going, we were very lucky to be accepted into the Australian Pavilion, and our brief for this exhibition was to create something, sort of suggested that it would be an installation that expressed or modelled our practice. So for us, we really wanted to make manifest this idea of rivalry and what we were talking about. So we created a series of towers that was our own sort of personal, sculptural, formal, site-specific response. It's in the heritage-listed gardens of the Giardini. There's a lot of heritage-listed trees, this idea of a sort of vertical forest of timber, and also this idea of an attractor, things that drew people to the pavilion, because our old pavilion was quite hidden. It was literally down a back path and people didn't know where it was. So we wanted to draw people in and draw people to the exhibition. But at a macro scale, we were really interested in having people involved, as many people as involved as possible. And the idea of making manifest rivalry, as well as making something that could cross boundaries at the Biennale, that could be accessible, and that was also a sort of breather. I think we worked out that at the Biennale there's something like 2,000 pieces of exhibition, individual things you could look at. And over the 2-day period that you have with your ticket, you have less than 30 seconds or something to look at each one. So it's physically impossible as a human to consume all of that information. So we weren't trying to do anything really sporty or Australian. We were trying to present something that was a counterbalance to that dense environment of information that the Biennale presents. And through that, for us, we've thought of our installation as a sort of framework or a gallery or a platform. And we did a worldwide call out to designers, and obviously had the advantage that the Biennale is a good draw card, that they could create objects for display as part of our work. So in this case, the objects were the foosball players, and more robust ones, ones made in cast steel, concrete, resin. They were outdoors and they were used physically as foosball tables for 3 months. And the ones that were more experimental or delicate were displayed inside in a gallery as part of the exhibition. And the pieces were curated together and they varied greatly. We had quite a strict design brief, and were really fascinated in what came back and the way that people expressed themselves And the way that as a collective it became this quite sort of tribal representation of things and of desires, and it had all stemmed from one brief. And through it, importantly, it's a sort of richness and diversity that we couldn't create by ourselves on our own for this project. It was made richer through the input of something like 30 artists from 10 countries making about 300 pieces. Another example for us of this productive rivalry was Everest. This was a big project, the occupation of Pier 2-3 in Walsh Bay for Sydney Art Month for the Living Room Theatre's production of I Love Todd Sampson. There were 10 teams, and we were one team that occupied half of the first floor of the pier to create a set design that was inhabitable by the audience and the actors for the final scene of the play, which was set on Mount Everest. And this is probably our cheapest project. I think the budget was $350 when we added it up. We worked together with Carter Williamson Architects, two of our sort of lighting designers and suppliers that we knew, and a professional rigger. And together we made a mountainscape that was 8 metres tall. We used about 4,000 metres of recycled newsprint that was recycled again after the exhibition. And it became this big immersive landscape. And something, again, that had a core team of designers from 5 different offices. So we had an unusual week of experience with 5 different architecture practices together, weaving paper. And as a little breather, we wanted to show you a video about this project, because for us, we're lucky enough to have a filmmaker as one of our collaborators, but we are very interested in communicating processes, and that's the idea of being experimental with the platform and making a relationship with the public, so really showing people how things are made and the sort of beauty of the process and the rawness. So that was Everest, and again, as you saw at the end, only possible really through a huge number of partners and sponsors and people that contributed their time to the project in kind.
So for about 2.5 years, we operated with these really romantic ideas, and we created these very beautiful videos and understood process deeply, but also wanted to really understand how we could make Archrival sustainable in our lives, but also as a model to talk to emerging architects about. We were really aware that we didn't want to talk about Archrival anymore unless it was sustainable economically, because that's really important to the profession. So we stumbled literally on a way of generating revenue for ourselves. You know, we both work in standard practice, we like to call it, where we receive design consultancy fees. But Archrival also receives fees for the hire and sale of our assets, and design and construct commissions. Yes, that's not abnormal at all. And we also source some funding through crowdfunding, though not very much at all. And these slides will just quickly describe to you the portion of revenue. So you can see that the hire of our assets is the majority of where we find our revenue. We receive design consultancy through really standard ways, through councils mainly and corporates. And design and construct and crowdfunding forms another small portion, but what was really interesting to us is the realisation that we could hire and sell our assets, which is something that we hadn't been taught about and we hadn't considered, and really took us by surprise. And I'll explain the example to you in a second. And then this secondary consideration is the startup costs for Archrival itself. You know, Archrival contributed a very small amount of capital to commence the organisation, and then you can see the revenue that's created around that. So I'm not sure if other architectural practices consider these kind of proportions, but what we've realised that the startup capital that we contributed to the organisation was really critical and very small to the amount of impact that we've able to have and secure revenue elsewhere. So that was a really amazing learning process for us. And as we said in the beginning, these tactics have changed over since 2011. So I'm sure when we talk to you in the future, they will be different, and we would have found other ways to make money. But at the moment, this is what we're working to, and what we found that because we've had this realisation of hiring and selling our assets, that the way we conceive projects in the beginning is really different from just considering design consultancy as a source of revenue. So I've got two examples to explain to you how that works, really, because we think it's really important to share this with emerging designers. As an example. So Jigsaw is a 3D mural in Waverley. It's just on Bronte Road in Bondi Junction, and it's on the wall of the Bondi Junction RSL, and it's 100 blocks that you can see in this picture with 3 sides, and there's a nought and a cross on 2 sides, and on the other side is a photograph which forms a very large scale 6-metre mural. The public are invited to come and play noughts and crosses or put the jigsaw together. It was commissioned by Waverley Council as a temporary piece, and just recently it's been made permanent, so it's our only permanent installation work. And interestingly to us, they've acquired it as part of their public artwork collection. And we didn't expect that in the beginning, which was really nice, and it has led to us considering different ways of how we put artworks together. So this is what it looks like when it's all the jigsaw is put together. The photograph is of some of the veterans of the Bondi Junction RSL, and there's a really great story of ownership of the piece there, which was one reason why it was acquired by council, because it was so well looked after by the community, which was really unexpected for us. The other side to the story is that the noughts and crosses are designed by architects, designers, industrial designers and graphic designers across Sydney. So they've created a pair of noughts and crosses that are spread across the mural. So it's very wide in its authorship. And you can see the ownership that people take of the work. And the other example to consider when we think about our alternate sources of revenue is Arena Calcetto, and Lucy just spoke to you about this work, and it came back to Sydney from Venice in 2013, and we started to tour it around Sydney and started to understand what type of demand the work had, because it was very topical to people. People enjoy playing foosball, and it was a way to activate spaces. So this is in Tonkin Zalaka Greer's Paddington Reservoir Gardens just off Oxford Street, and the City of Sydney were really interested in ways to activate this space. People were using it, but in very low numbers, and we were able, with very great effort, to get these towers into that sunken garden, and as a result people played them a lot. And then it moved to Pyramid Park, Hillfallis's Pyramid Park, and then down to the Rocks. So this is pictured in the Rocks in Circular Quay, and it was there for the World Cup. And just before, about 4 months before or 6 months before the World Cup, we started to understand the demand for the pieces, considering the World Cup was coming up and that people wanted to play football on the streets while the World Cup was on. So we were really able to leverage this work and get it installed across the city. We think about 200,000 people played Arena Calcetto in the Rocks, because every time we went down there it was full of people playing constantly. So this was an amazing surprise to us, and a really great understanding for us to figure out how to make Archrival sustainable in the future by the sale of our assets. So at the same time we also made smaller versions of these towers, so smaller versions of the foosball tables, so without the towers, at the MLC Centre, who commissioned new Arena Calcettos essentially, at the same time that the works were installed at the Rocks. So as we consider these tactics for change, we are constantly questioning what's going to happen next. And what we can see happening, and I'm sure all of you in the room can see what's happening, is that the way we have been taught and what the business community and a lot of the other design community call design thinking has been taken outside of our profession and has been used really widely to solve problems. So that's really brilliant, but what we understand is that the architecture profession isn't leveraging that skill well enough. So we are constantly trying to figure out ways to talk about how we can leverage that better. And one of the ways we do that is by repurposing our works. So these are construction drawings of Arena Calcetto, and at the moment it's been decommissioned and it's in storage, but we're trying to figure out how to recommission it in another way. And so it's not a foosball table, but perhaps it's a chair sculpture that people can enjoy in a public parkland. And so using our skills to solve problems that people essentially haven't thought of yet, which is what the business community is doing. And then the other thing that we're working on currently is the Architecture Festival. Lucy and I are event directors with John O'Callaghan, who's an urban planner and, what do we call him, social media guru. And we're working on the program for the Sydney Architecture Festival, and we're really trying to understand how to talk to the public better about architecture and talking about design in people's everyday lives, and but not talking about it in the way that we talk about it, and actually just occupy public space better and offer activities in public space that aren't currently offered.
So to finish, just going back to the topic, so change is a competitive advantage. We think it's impossible to instigate change without having a manifesto. There's a lot of to and fro in architecture about manifestos, but for us, we think you have to have a position and you also have to question practice. So you can't just go into practice blindly without thinking about it. It's really important to question the context and the consequences of practice. And we found this amazing diagram. This is 110 years of architecture declarations that was put together as an infographic, and you can look it up and you can read the sort of key ideas. So a really interesting spectrum of what architects have been saying recently. And we see the manifesto as both a tool to challenge a spectrum of ideas in the industry, and also a design tool that if you invent a manifesto, you can be really clear about your beliefs and how you want to act and what sort of impacts you can have on the profession. And for us, there's an important advocacy role, which is linked to agency. So really thinking about the cause and effect of the industry and where we can go. So a really quick snapshot of our own manifesto. The real one is much denser. But just to summarise, to adopt moonshot thinking, it's really important to think about your questions and invent new questions. Be strategic. That's something that we're quite passionate about. There's a few different issues, things like gender issues that we haven't touched on, but strategy is important to us because we are small and young and female, and we have to be strategic in order to get ahead. Recognise that small-scale actions can catalyse change. So we're not arguing that our projects are huge or world-changing, but we have seen, we've been doing it for a few years now, so we have seen that small actions can create change, and through that you can create momentum. So we're passionate about that. And also question your manifesto. So write one and then question it and challenge it, and look back at it. And every time we do a talk, we sort of use it as an opportunity to recap on our thinking and look at what we've done and where we've gone. And 2 don'ts. Don't participate in unproductive rivalry. Think about that in the industry and what sort of competition is unproductive. Often the competition model is unproductive, and the most unproductive thing that we're quite passionate about is working for free. And obviously we've been working for free for ourselves a lot, but we see that as a very different project than working for free for clients or employers. And to end with something from Buckminster Fuller, the same sort of thinking behind the moonshot, that you shouldn't challenge reality, you should just build something new that makes the existing model obsolete. So for us, that's an inspiring quote. It's obviously nothing new. We position ourselves within a context of much greater, more experienced thinkers, and we're continuing in that vein, we hope. And if you want to see more about our projects, we are at archrival.org. Thank you very much. I think that's our experience from having worked in practice. We've both worked at very large practices as well as quite small practices, and also just the current thinking and reading. When we were reading things like the Reiber report at the same time that we were thinking about pairing up and making Archrival, for us the things that were being published they rang true with us. So we could see merit in the arguments that other things were changing and other industries were changing, and obviously we have friends outside of architecture and we hear about things that they're doing, and it didn't seem that the same sort of change or innovation was happening in our industry, in our own experience. We're talking about our limited personal experience.
I think the building industry and architecture has a lot of innovation around building technology and construction methods, but our way of practicing hasn't evolved as fast as it should have. So, and that's the comparison that Lucy's been talking about with the business sector, where they've considered different ways that competition can help evolve their practices, but we haven't done that as well. So I don't think we're saying that the building product is not innovating, but the practice isn't.
At the start of the talk, you mentioned about moving into other areas of the profession, let's say into government or something like that. Being able to legitimise architecture, because in Europe, most plans and that have to be done through an architect, but in Australia, that's still not a requirement. The councils give people plans on how to do what's required for the submission for their house, yet in Europe you've got to actually use an architect to do that. Have you thought of getting that? And I've been looking at this for when I started 30 years ago. It still wasn't in place. No one was pushing for the legitimisation of architecture. And even today, we're still not allowed to advertise on our professions, where the Law Society allows certain professions, the law profession, to advertise on TV and media, yet we're still not allowed to do that.
It's a very interesting question. We're thinking a lot about architecture and media at the moment, and the way that we don't have a voice in mainstream media. There was actually a workshop today at the Institute about social media and architecture, so it's this evolving, it's this new sort of organic way of promoting architects. We have talked about that a lot as well, the way that it appears in Europe. There's more sort of committees with architects on them, and on a high level, on a planning level, they seem to be more involved. But people like Vision Arc that we mentioned, they're going even further. They're saying that you could have architects doing really big sort of world global strategy stuff with much bigger organisations, and that it would be super valuable. So for us, it's like advocating that role, promoting or advertising the role of the architect, that the architect could help you in all of these different ways, whether it's a house or something bigger, whether it's this sort of design thinking, using our sort of ability to synthesize information and be creative and sort of come up with other ways of thinking. So it's definitely important and difficult to know how to push that and make it happen, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that the way that we do that, rather than approaching government and that high level of rule making, essentially, is that we do it through making projects, and that, you know, every time someone uses the foosball table and looks up at the towers, that they understand that a group of architects have made it, and that they never thought about architects making those kind of things before, and activating a public space in the rocks in a different way, rather than approaching it through government and trying to change policy. I think there's certain other people that do it that way that we don't have the capacity to do. So we try and do it in our own small strategic way where we have skill and support.